Oh, yeah. I know. No, exactly. That was totally.
The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will now come to order. The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations is meeting today to hear testimony on sexual harassment at the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and to our witnesses for giving their time to be here. At a previous hearing on sexual harassment at the Department of the Interior, we heard from witnesses that employees who work in remote, isolated places like national parks are at a higher risk of being sexually harassed. But remote workplaces are not limited to our public lands. Men and women who work in our fisheries and oceans, like those with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, are also at risk. Today's hearing will look at how sexual harassment and assault has affected NOAA employees and how NOAA is trying to address the issue. Sexual assault and sexual harassment are not new problems at NOAA. In 2014, whistleblowers spoke about how pervasive these issues are, especially among female scientists and contractors. Addressing sexual harassment at any organization is challenging, but NOAA's complex, decentralized structure and the nature of the duties many of its workers perform makes it especially challenging for them. Many of NOAA's 12,000 employees and approximately 7,700 contractors are stationed at sea or other remote locations and workplaces that are frequently male-dominated, physical in nature, and far away from the usual support services. In the National Defense Authorization Act of 2017, Congress directed NOAA to take steps to address this issue, including issuance of a comprehensive sexual assault and harassment policy and establishment of a victims advocacy program. NOAA has nominally met most of its objectives, but as we will hear today, there is still room for improvement and the need for additional authorities and resources. For example, their Workplace Violence Prevention and Response Program, which is responsible for coordinating all harassment and assault reporting, implementing a holistic training platform, and providing services to its victims across the organization, is up and running. It is severely understaffed with only a single person. In a 2018 report to Congress, NOAA detailed 22 allegations of sexual assault from 2015 to 2018. And the newest report that was just submitted to us this week showed 2 additional allegations. Most of these assaults are reported by fishery observers. Fishery observers are employees who are often stationed aboard private commercial fishing vessels or in processing plants where they collect samples and data to support NOAA's mission. And many of these observers are young female college graduates who are just starting their careers in the scientific field. And federal law requires their presence on fishing vessels, but that doesn't mean crew members and captains also appreciate them being there and enforcing regulations. Observers have frequently reported hostility and general harassment from crew members. And when aimed at female observers, this hostility often takes the form of sexual harassment or assault. Making matters worse, there is often only one observer on a vessel, and sometimes the only woman on board, out in the ocean far from port for weeks or even months at a time. And despite these vulnerabilities, fishery observers do not currently qualify for the same access to many of the sexual assault and harassment prevention and response services that NOAA offers. These observers and other similarly positioned NOAA workers need protection from further harm, and not just the most severe incidents like sexual assault. There also needs to be a commitment to prevent those less obvious but still harmful behaviors like inappropriate jokes or comments that observers have come to accept as simply part of the job. This behavior, no matter the intention, degrades women's feelings of safety and security on the job, which undoubtedly only further widens the gap, the gender gap, we see in science, technology, engineering, and math, or the STEM fields. A change is possible, but it will not come by simply checking the boxes for policy updates or verbal commitments. A real sustained shift in how NOAA workers are treated will require a persistent time and financial commitment of resources from leadership to changing a culture that has existed for years or even decades. NOAA has the responsibility to build a respectful culture within the STEM, maritime, and aviation fields that is free of sexual discrimination and harassment. As one oceanographer and mariner, Dr. Julia O'Hearn, wrote in a Washington Post op-ed, "I want future female deckhands, technicians, captains, and other professionals to expect without hesitation that they, too, can embrace science and the sea." I look forward to hearing from our witnesses more about how we can achieve exactly that. And with that, I was going to recognize Ranking Member Gonzalez-Colon, but we will have to recess very shortly for votes. So we'll be back.
Do the 5 minutes and then, yes.
You want to? Okay. I'll tell you what. Very well. I will now recognize Ranking Member Gonzalez-Colon for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and I thank the chairman and the witnesses for being here today to discuss a very important topic, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration efforts to address sexual assault and harassment in the workplace. And I think that's one of the biggest issues for many of the members of Congress that are here today. First, let me say that I take this issue of sexual assault and harassment, sexual harassment, very seriously. I cannot be tolerated in the federal workforce, and every employee deserves a workplace free of sexual assault and harassment. Understanding this, NOAA has begun to develop a new agency initiative, a SASH prevention program, and SASH stands for Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment. The SASH prevention program mission is to establish a culture of professionalism and respect through education, training, and when needed, victim response and support. NOAA has taken several important steps to begin with implementing the SASH prevention program. And for example, NOAA has opened a helpline which provides crisis intervention, referrals, and emotional support to victims of sexual assault and harassment. This helpline can be accessed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Additionally, the agencies have written and implemented a sexual assault and sexual harassment prevention and response policy. And this zero tolerance policy defines unacceptable behavior, encouraging employees to report such behavior, and outlines available resources for victims. These are all the steps in the right direction, and I am encouraged by NOAA's action. And to understand the bigger picture, we must examine the data on sexual assault and harassment at NOAA. In 2017, NOAA published its first data on this topic. Last year, the agency found that four instances of sexual assault and 21 instances of sexual harassment had taken place. The following year, the number of reported cases of sexual assault increased to 22, while the reported numbers of incidents of sexual harassment increased to 52. While still nowhere near perfect, these numbers declined to 2 allegations of sexual assault and 34 sexual harassment allegations in 2019. This is progress, but again, more work remains. And Ms. Kelly Bodner, who serves as NOAA Workplace Violence Advocate and is the only career official working on the SASH prevention program, is in the audience today. Thank you and welcome to be in this hearing. When she met with our committee staff prior to the release of the 2019 report, she estimated that an increase in the number of reported instances of sexual assault and harassment will occur in the short term, but that NOAA's work will eventually produce a downward trend. The latest numbers on the 2019 report indicate that the program may be seeing some success. In the 2019 report, however, also indicates that it's premature to speak to any trends or discuss improvement as a result of these efforts. And I agree, given the limited data, that trends are difficult to determine at this point. NOAA has more work to do, and the agency should keep the committee apprised of the important developments and further statistics on the SASH prevention program. In the last hearing held by this subcommittee in October, we discussed sexual harassment in the Department of Interior. This hearing, the department reported that the percentage of their employees who knew how to report harassment jumped from 62% in 2017 to 94% in 2018. In turn, the percentage of department employees who experience inappropriate behavior dropped from 35% in 2017 to 18% in 2019. Statistics like this confirm that as the knowledge of how to report instances of sexual harassment increases, such unacceptable behavior decreases, thanks God. As we discuss sexual assault and harassment today, please keep these statistics in mind, and they could serve as a model for other agencies, including NOAA. I look forward to the hearing and to hear more about NOAA's SASH prevention program and the continued efforts to eliminate sexual assault and harassment in our workforce. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. As I mentioned, unfortunately, votes have been called, and we'll need to recess and come right back. We appreciate everyone's patience, and so the hearing is now in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
Testing 1, 2, testing. Testing 1, 2, 3, testing, testing, testing.
Well, I want to thank the witnesses and the audience for your patience and forbearance. The Subcommittee on Oversight Investigations will now come back to order. I'd like to introduce our witnesses today. Dr. Neil Jacobs is the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for the Environmental Observation and Prediction, performing duties of Undersecretary for Commerce for Oceans and the Atmosphere in the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. Ms. Julie Dale is the Community Prevention and Education Manager at Standing Together Against Rape, Inc. Ms. Linda Seabrook is General Counsel and Director of Workplace Safety and Equity at Futures Without Violence. Under committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left, and then red when time has expired. After the witnesses have testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask them questions. And with that, the chair will now recognize Dr. Neil Jacobs.
Thank you, Chairman Cox, Ranking Member Gonzalez-Colon, and Chairman Huffman, for inviting me here to testify today before you on how NOAA is working to prevent sexual assault and sexual harassment and ensure a safe environment for our workforce to carry out their critical mission. NOAA faces specific risk factors for SASH. We have decentralized workforce that spans over 600 locations in all U.S. states and territories. Some workers are in isolated locations with limited access to resources. NOAA is also in the midst of a generational shift within the workforce, with an influx of younger employees highlighting clashing generational attitudes towards appropriate behavior in the workplace. Nothing typifies the convergence of these risk factors better than fisheries observers who are placed on commercial fishing vessels to collect fisheries data. The job of an observer is challenging as they work alongside fishermen in stressful and often hazardous conditions. Because their job involves reporting observations related to compliance with the fisheries regulations, they can become the target of interference, intimidation, and harassment, including sexual harassment and assault. NOAA trains fisheries observers to recognize and report harassment. Satellite phones and other independent communication devices, such as personal locator beacons, are made available. Regional observer programs in NOAA's Law Enforcement Office respond to and provide victim assistance resources to reported incidents and observers of sexual assault and harassment. While fisheries observers remain one of the highest risk populations for sexual harassment and assault, these have also occurred on NOAA's research vessels and in agency facilities. For some employees, sexual harassment creates a daily struggle that has profound impact on the victim's professional development, performance, and overall well-being. NOAA's Workplace Violence Prevention and Response Program is the center of expertise for addressing SASH issues at NOAA. The program is in its second year of operation and is focused on 3 strategic goals. 1, embedding full-time victim advocates in all major regional campuses. 2, providing comprehensive prevention services. And 3, ensuring training to increase competency around addressing harassment. NOAA has several contracts with leaders in bystander intervention, victim advocacy, computer-based training, and prevention of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace. One contract with Standing Together Against Rape, or STAR, allows NOAA employees, contractors, and affiliates in Alaska to receive victim advocacy services, including crisis intervention and emotional support. To undertake the agency's prevention and assessment needs, we contracted with Sartorius Solutions, an international leader in sexual assault and sexual harassment prevention, to develop prevention products, including bystander intervention for NOAA's highest risk areas. A third contract is with EventID, a leading computer-based training specializing in sexual harassment prevention that will provide foundational training to the entire NOAA workforce. 3 weeks ago, I announced EventID's computer-based training via an all-hands message. A 1-hour version of this training is mandatory for all NOAA employees, and a more comprehensive 2-hour version is mandatory for all NOAA supervisors, myself included. The scope and complexity of the issues at NOAA demand a comprehensive, multi-pronged strategy that includes dedicated full-time staff to execute it successfully. To date, we only have 1 full-time victim advocate at NOAA in the Workplace Violence Prevention Program, but are working expeditiously to provide additional staffing and resources. NOAA has created a SASH Council that meets monthly and engages stakeholders on the topic to track data, trends, and prevention initiatives. NOAA continues to train its workforce and will be providing cutting-edge education from leaders in the field of sexual assault and sexual harassment prevention, diversity, inclusion, and civility via upcoming summit this fall. I have only been at NOAA for 2 years and assumed the role of acting agency head a year ago. While we still have a long way to go, I want to recognize the significant progress that has taken place over the last 18 months. Kelly Bonner has done an amazing job designing this program and setting a new course. And while she is NOAA's subject matter expert, I'm grateful to have this opportunity to be here today so that I can tell you myself that prevention of sexual harassment and assault is a top priority. In fact, the FY20 budget request of $2.7 million, the highest % increase of any new program in the agency. If this request not only reflects my commitment in addressing SASH, but also my confidence in the plan that we have set into motion to address these long-standing issues. I thank you for your attention of this very important topic, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobs. The chair will now recognize Ms. Julie Dale for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman T.J. Cox, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon, and Chairman Huffman, and other members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you the issues facing NOAA observers and how our organization, Standing Together Against Rape, or STAR, supports them. My name is Julie. I have been working in the sexual violence prevention field at STAR in Anchorage, Alaska for over 7 years, and have been working closely with observers and NOAA for over 4. While the connection the work a rape crisis center in Alaska does and the work NOAA does might not be immediately apparent, the reality is that Alaska has the highest rates of sexual violence in the nation. These incredibly high rates are not confined to our landmass, but impact our offshore environments as well. As a lifelong Alaskan, I greatly value the work observers do to help preserve our fishing industry in my home state, as well as across the nation. And I am passionate about helping our fishing industry be as safe and sustainable as possible. As you may be aware, NOAA observers are professionally trained biological scientists gathering firsthand data on what is caught and thrown back, which supports science, conservation, and management activities. This data is used to monitor fisheries, assess fish populations, set fishing quotas, and inform management. Observers also support compliance with fishing and safety regulations. It is a necessary role for scientists in our fishing industry if we hope to maintain a fishing industry at all. Commercial fishing is an inherently dangerous job. Slippery decks, heavy equipment, isolation, and rough seas all contribute to the perils observers and fish industry workers face at sea. In addition to the job being inherently dangerous, observers are immediately placed in a vulnerable position the moment they step onto a vessel, as fishing crews often view an observer as an outsider or a snitch. Observers' vulnerable position becomes even more perilous as it is combined with being isolated, far from shore, for extended periods of time, without access to communication with individuals off of the boat, and potentially witnessing fishing violations that the vessel crew does not want to be reported. This can and does result in observers being pressured, harassed, threatened, and physically and or sexually assaulted to either interfere or prevent them from completing their job. While providing training, I have received firsthand examples from observers of how this harassment starts. These examples include, but are not limited to, being told to shuck scallops, clean the slime line, measure crab, or even cook for the crew. These duties are not part of the observer's job, and the intent is to remove them from their assigned position so they're not able to perform their job functions. Therein lies the power and control. If an observer refuses to participate in these behaviors, they're not part of the team. And if they do participate, the crew then can hold over their heads that they were not at their assigned jobs. These harmful behaviors can escalate quickly and result in the observers not having access to food, sleeping quarters, bathroom facilities, or the captain's deck. All of these tactics hold power and control over the observers, which contributes to the sexual violence experienced by these individuals. There is good work being done, but it's not enough. There are some real barriers to observers reporting and seeking help. These can include gaining a reputation for being a narc, not wanting to worry their friends and family, not sure if it's a reportable offense, having to go back out on the same boat with the same crew again, and being blacklisted from the industry, not able to do the work for which they're so passionate. The response observers receive when reporting these behaviors is very disheartening and ranges from, well, it's just hazing, to what do you expect is going to happen on a fishing boat? I bet they thought you were flirting with them. We told you not to wear yoga pants. And well, it happened to me too. I made it through just fine. You're going to get over it. We need to create safe environments for our observers and prevent further harm from happening by providing consistent prevention training for industry personnel, enacting enforceable legislation that holds individuals who harm accountable, and changing the norms from those that are tolerant of sexual violence to supporting and believing survivors. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I will be happy to respond to questions.
Thank you, Ms. Dale. The chair will now recognize Ms. Linda Seabrook for 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Cox, Ranking Member Gonzalez-Colon, and Chairman Huffman. Good afternoon. For more than 30 years, Futures Without Violence has led the way in creating innovative solutions to end violence against women and children around the world and help communities heal and thrive. On behalf of myself and Futures, I would like to thank Chairman Cox and this subcommittee for inviting me to speak with you today. At Futures, we are honored to lead the only national resource center dedicated to addressing the impacts of gender-based violence and harassment on workers in the workplace. Authorized by the Violence Against Women Act and funded through DOJ's Office on Violence Against Women, the National Resource Center on Workplace Responses helps employers, employees, workplace stakeholders, and others improve responses to violence and harassment. Most importantly for our time here today, the Resource Center serves as the technical assistance provider to executive branch agencies in crafting and implementing policies and programs designed to prevent and respond to such harassment and violence impacting the wide range of workplaces and workers who serve the public good. We also focus our efforts on the nation's most vulnerable workers, such as those in agriculture, hotel, and janitorial industries. These workers, who often perform their work in isolated environments, are women or members of otherwise marginalized groups, are paid low wages, and often perform their jobs through subcontracted work arrangements, experience the highest rates of sexual violence in the workplace. Sexual violence and harassment, no matter where it occurs, is primarily about power. Thus, the process of creating effective responses to and preventing this conduct must seek to leverage the collective power of all in the workplace to bring about necessary cultural change and democratize responsibility for creating an environment that promotes respect, equity, dignity, and thereby greater safety and support. Workers know how, where, to whom, by whom, and under what circumstances sexual harassment occurs. Therefore, they must be intimately involved in the policies, procedures, and processes intended to protect them. At Futures, we engage in collaborations to help build workplace-appropriate responses and interventions that promote prevention and culture change. One such collaboration was with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. With Futures' expertise in sexual violence prevention and using Sunright-certified brands as a pilot site employer, we collectively developed a worker-engaged and led workplace-based education and response program as a companion to CIW's Fair Food program, a program which has effectively addressed the long-standing scourge of sexual violence in the nation's fields and farms. Some of the working environments at NOAA have similar factors that account for vulnerability to experiencing sexual harassment on the job as the agricultural industry. For example, fishery observers, who are often recent college graduates without the gravitas of experience, working in isolated, remote working environments on behalf of an agency that is not necessarily their employer, are in a situation that makes them vulnerable to experiencing sexual violence and harassment. I have been provided with and have reviewed NOAA's SASH policy, which is thorough and an excellent first step. I'm happy to address specific concerns about this policy, but what I would like to impress upon you today is how important it is for the process of implementation to incorporate worker input and participation. Doing so provides the means for creating that shared responsibility and collective engagement for changing culture that we know brings a policy to life. What numerous studies have revealed, and what I can also speak to as a survivor of sexual harassment, is that most survivors do not want to report or avail themselves of the legal or administrative remedies to address this conduct. They just want it to stop and not happen in the first place, to them or anyone else. So while policies that provide greater protections and ensure greater accountability are much needed and most welcome, we must also seek to engage workers, survivors, and management to work together to change the culture that facilitates this conduct in the first place. Available on the Resource Center website on the Sexual Harassment subpage, we have many resources that I'm happy to discuss later on. But I wanted to leave you with the premise that workers, and especially survivors, should be front and center in the implementation of these policies and practices. Incorporating trauma-informed and survivor-centered approaches in investigations, trainings, practices, and protocols provide greater assurance that such policies will be engaged in the first place and engenders trust throughout the workplace to promote collective responsibility for the kind of workplace every worker deserves. Thank you.
Thank you. And now entertain some questions. And really, kind of the first thing is Mr. Seabrook, when you're describing this culture of intimidation, harassment, and sometimes the observers are essentially made to believe that it's just part of the job. And you've described some of the things that were being done to, or should be done to shift that culture. And I'd like you to provide a little bit more elaboration or color on how NOAA has a role to change that culture. And certainly, Dr. Jacobs, a little bit more color on some of the things that you had mentioned that you're doing to bring about that shift.
Yes, so it's interesting. There was a study that was done by the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, where they surveyed restaurant workers about sexual harassment. And when they just asked the workers, have you ever been sexually harassed? The rates weren't actually that high. But then once they started to describe what sexual harassment actually was, they saw significant rates of sexual harassment as identified. So when you say that it's just part of the job, that's often the experience of many workers today, whether it's in the agricultural industry, the retail industry, or the restaurant industry, or at NOAA. I think what is most important is to have again, that kind of collective responsibility for building the type of workplace in which everyone can thrive. So it's democratizing that type of responsibility among the workforce and empowering bystanders to stand up, turning coworkers from bystanders to upstanders.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Jacobs?
So we've been spending a lot of time, obviously, with this for the last 18 months. I've been spending a tremendous amount of time with Kelly Bonner. We've set up contracts for 9 additional investigators. We originally only had 1. Those were started in July of 2019. The response time is now, it's gone from weeks down to 48 hours. We have a mandatory online training module that were released on February 5th. Right now, about 40% of the agency has already completed it. We've stood up a SASH council in 2019 with representatives from around the agency. Hiring, obviously, as you've heard, is an issue. I've personally called enterprise services myself to get them to speed up on some of the hiring processes so we can get this staffed out. Obviously, training is very, very important. Another thing that we're working on is centralizing the reporting structure of the data, getting a database set up. That's going to help streamline how the reports are uploaded and the format of them, because there's a lot of uncertainty and confusion around the agency about different reporting formats of the data and how it's collected. So streamlining that process is very important. We have 6 external contracts to help provide a foundation of training and education and victim services. These are a lot of things that we have done, things that next steps will be bystander intervention training. So that's another computer module that we're going to do later this year. We have a SASH summit coming up this fall. We're working on developing and rolling out a prevention plan. I mean, obviously we have a plan in place now, but we're forming it as we go based on what we're learning. And then really working on increasing victim advocacy services. We do plan to hire internal investigators, so not just having investigators as contractors, but having internal hires on this, I think is really gonna help us a lot.
Great, thank you. And well, certainly these are all very positive steps. Have we seen yet a shift or positive results really out there on the water yet? Any feedback from some of the observers that the culture has changed on this boat, or people are actually more mindful about what they're doing?
I would say it's probably too early to tell, really. I mean, I've got a lot of positive emails and feedback from the all-hands message I sent out with the link to the training module, but this is, in 2017, you know, we had some numbers that came in, the law enforcement part of NOAA, who they were collecting data, but they didn't know where to send it. So those numbers didn't get included until 2018. So there appears to be a spike in 2018. A lot of those are previous year's numbers that they didn't know where to report. And then also the Lasker incident got reported that showed up in 2018. So 2019, I would say 2018 is probably anomalously high. 2019 is maybe too early to tell. We would expect, as we develop and roll out this prevention program, that the numbers may go up before they come down, because a lot of these victims don't exactly know where to report or what the proper process to take is. So I wouldn't be surprised to see an increase before a decrease, but once the program is fully rolled out, I would expect to see the numbers decreasing, particularly over the next year or two.
Great, fair enough, thank you. The chair will now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, all the witnesses, for waiting. I know sometimes when votes are called, everything gets disrupted, so thank you. Again, I'm sorry about that. But hearing the testimonies of Dr. Jacobs and Ms. Dale, there's one issue that concerns me, and that's the decentralized system of NOAA. Having personnel in more than 600 locations, as you already specified, including the territories, and how difficult it is to work and have that kind of situation, to work with sexual assault and harassment. Can you elaborate more, Dr. Jacobs, in terms of what policies the agency pursue or have explored today to address the risk posed by this decentralized system? And later on, I'm going to follow back with Ms. Dale in terms of the experience in Alaska and the vessels, planes, and ships. Because, I mean, coming from a territory, I know how difficult it is when you get employees all over without anyone there in a vessel to help out. Dr. Jacobs.
Thank you for the question. So we, obviously Alaska being a remote region is a challenge to get outreach. So we've contracted with STAR to provide victim advocacy services. That is something in the lower 48, when I was referring to centralized, it's more of a centralized data management and reporting structure. The actual victim advocates we want out in the field, we have 6 different line offices that break their coverage down into different regions. For compliance with the law, we're actually looking at dividing into north, south, east, and west. And then OMAO, we would have, you know, folks there as well. So the victim advocates will be in the different regions, but the centralized aspect's mostly going to be the data reporting.
I think the partnership is great. And my question to you, Dr. Jacobs, is what kind of information or guidelines or policies may be brought after having that experience with the partnership in order to address this kind of issues in isolated areas? If we are not there yet, fine. If you're working on this, please keep us posted.
So there's a couple things that could be very helpful, particularly in the Alaska region when it comes to vessels. When it pertains to the Magnuson-Stevens Act, there's language in there that specifically references issues when they only occur on vessels. So this would apply only to an observer on a vessel. And it would be tremendously helpful for us if the solution was to just remove reference to on a vessel, because a lot of times these issues happen at port or at hotels when the ship's not actually, I mean, if it even happens on the dock. I mean, there's another part in there that discusses forcibly intimidate, and there's a series of, intimidate, assault, and so on after the word forcibly. And forcibly is kind of a hard word to define. It would be very helpful if it just said intimidate and assault.
Ms. Dale?
So, as an agency that's responding to victims of sexual violence, one of the most important things that we're focusing on as STAR in this partnership is the appropriate response when somebody discloses they've been harmed. And that appropriate response goes beyond legislation and beyond prosecution. We want to make sure that observers, regardless of the incident that has happened to them, is supported in being believed and continuing to be able to do their jobs as safely as possible. And so as our agency, we're looking at that, that victim support as our role in that partnership.
Thank you. Dr. Jacobs, going back to you with the goals of the Workplace Violence Program, you said that you are looking to have a full-time regional victim advocate embedded in all major regional campuses. What is the status of this effort, and if you need more help?
We absolutely do need more help. Right now, we have one certified and trained victim advocate. She's sitting right behind me. We have 3 others who are trained, but they're not certified or credentialed yet, so they're in the process of that. It's kind of a two-pronged approach of staffing out and also bringing some investigators as FTEs. I would really love to hire investigators internally rather than to have to contract it out, so we actually have more oversight of the investigators' work. And then once we get the victims advocates credentialed, then it's really a matter of outreach and awareness and making sure that the employees in the field know who to access, how to access them, and building that type of communication and understanding. The prevention side of it is largely, the modules and the training, but it's how we handle these. We went from weeks down to 48 hours by just bringing on 9 additional contractors for the investigation, and shortened the investigation time from months down to around 100 to 120 days. But we have a long way to go still. So definitely, I would love to work with everyone here on trying to push this further.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobs. I know my time has expired. We got a lot of questions, but we can submit it for the record.
Thank you so much, Ranking Member. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that the gentleperson from California, Representative Huffman, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's proceedings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say, as the chair of the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittee, where we spend a lot of time talking about the NOAA programs, I'm really grateful to you and your staff and your leadership in choosing to do a deeper dive into this subject. It's really important, and it's a human side of these programs that we talk about so much. Dr. Jacobs, I also want to thank you for being here, because the Commerce Department has obviously sent someone with the right scope of authority and a base of knowledge, and you're here answering questions. That's a far cry from the non-responsiveness that we get from the Department of Interior, to be perfectly candid. They have given up sending witnesses with the right position and with actual knowledge to answer our questions. And it's good to just be having a serious conversation about a serious subject. This is the way real, nonpartisan oversight of a serious subject ought to go. So I thank you for that. It seems to me that we all agree the safety and well-being of employees and those who are employed on behalf of NOAA should be the highest priority of the agency, and resources and services should be readily available and accessible to them. Dr. Jacobs, you've talked a bit about the fiscal year 20 budget and some programs and some dollar figures where it seems to suggest a greater emphasis, but I want to focus in on the number of personnel, starting with how many employees and contractors actually work for NOAA. Do you know off the top of your head the number of employees and contractors?
So we have just under 12,000 FTEs, and I think roughly about twice that in contractors.
Oh, so that's even more contractors than I had assumed. I had thought 7,700 contractors and affiliates, so I think you've given an even higher number than I had. And I think I understood you to say that you've currently got one full-time employee and 2 detailees in the Workplace Violence Prevention and Response Program, with 2 more FTEs in the process of being hired. Do I get that right?
So we have 2 more in the process of being hired. These are for the victim advocates. We also have 1 full-time. We have 3 more that are trained but not credentialed, and then we have other contractors doing investigations.
Okay.
And then there's a lot of other people in HR and the like doing work on this issue.
Why is it taking so long to fill those positions?
Some of it is just hiring. I mean, I'm sure you're probably aware that we've had hiring challenges in the Weather Service and elsewhere. It's the same hiring process. That is a slow process. It's something that, this is why I said I called Enterprise Services myself to try to expedite one of these individuals. The hiring process takes a while. I wasn't fully aware of how deep the problems were until, probably a year and a half ago. And so really focusing in on last year's budget when we had about $1 million in the program, and then adding an additional 1.7 this year. So getting...
So I appreciate that, but in terms of the number of personnel, wouldn't you agree that the numbers we're talking about are not a lot to stand up a prevention and response program for over 12,000 employees, plus all those affiliates that we mentioned?
Oh,
you feel like that's an adequate number?
No, not at all. I completely agree with you. We definitely need more people.
What would be the right number?
I think, we would probably have to scale up. I would like at least 1 victim advocate in the various regions. We also have contracts with agencies like STAR to help us out as well. We have 6 different contracts, so we actually have, under contract, a lot of individuals working on this. But I would like to see actual hires in the agency, FTEs working on this.
Does your FY20 budget request reflect the staffing that would get you to the number you need?
The additional 1.7 would, some of that would go to staffing, yes.
Okay. Moving on, we all know that female employees are disproportionately harmed by sexual harassment and assault, especially working in remote locations, such as some of these fisheries assignments for observers and monitors. They're often the sole NOAA-affiliated employee on these vessels as part of, but they're a very important part of our fishery management framework. So it troubles me that so many observers have reported sexual harassment, and surely there are a lot more who've experienced it and not bothered to report it. Dr. Jacobs, do you think that, last question, I know I'm out of time, I hope there might be another round, but are the resources and services that are available to NOAA employees also available to affiliates and contractors such as the observers in so many cases?
They are available, but a lot of the things, for example, the module, they're not, the training is not necessarily mandatory. So when some of the fisheries, the observer program, when they do go through training, it's a couple week-long course, and there is a couple hours on SASH, but when it comes to these modules and other things, we don't necessarily have the same authorities over contractors that we do the FTEs.
Do you think they know those resources are available to them?
Well, probably not. We're in the process of trying to make them more aware of this. So this is part of the awareness and outreach that we're doing.
I'm out of time, Mr. Chair, but thank you.
Well, thank you, and we will have subsequent rounds as well. And Dr. Jacobs, as I mentioned in my earlier statement, sexual harassment is certainly not a problem that's just limited to NOAA. And in a previous hearing, we invited the Department of Interior to discuss their issues with sexual harassment and how they were addressing that. And one of the things that helped Interior better understand how to best address their problem was a department-wide climate survey that the Obama administration had administered in early 2017. And the survey gave the department really invaluable insight into different kinds of harassment that was occurring, whether or not the victims had reported that harassment, and why they chose to report it or not. And the survey also showed that while harassment was an issue across the department, there were nuances that differentiated the individual bureaus within the department. And having that information helped each bureau draft and implement their own tailored action plans. And given the value of the information of that survey, does NOAA have plans in place to conduct an agency-wide workplace environment survey? And if they did or didn't, what are the challenges in doing that?
I'm sure we'll do additional surveys, but as part of the training module that I released on February 7th, the beginning of the module has a survey in it, asking a lot of questions about, not just your perception of your workplace environment, but do you feel like you know where to go? Do you know what to do? And then at the end of the training session, there is an additional survey. I would expect that those results of those surveys after the training module is completed will give us a lot of information, and we'll use that to go forward to see when and where we need to do additional surveys.
Well, great, and thank you. And so, and back to you, in your latest report to Congress, which we thank you so much for delivering this week, shows that the Fishery Observer Program is in dire need of support to prevent and respond to assault and harassment of observers in general. And as we've heard today, observers are in charge of making sure that fishing vessels and crews are in compliance with fishing regulations. And in that sense, their work can directly impact how profitable a given fishing trip is for the crew. And for example, observers are responsible for making sure certain fishing quotas aren't exceeded. And as you can imagine, this can put them in a potentially precarious, unwelcome position on the boat. And we've received written statements from observers. It describes some of these harassments and threats. In fact, in one instance, a fellow was on a fishing vessel in the South Pacific, and after refusing to lie about how much tuna the crew caught, he was harassed and put in an environment of hostility and fear for his life. And certainly after he reported this and after experiences of reporting other violations, including illegal dumping. And there's no question that these observers need resources and support to help them navigate these potentially dangerous situations. And I think in your testimony, you stated that regional observer programs are responsible for providing these resources. Does this mean that observers in every region receive identical training services and communication devices, and that all of those are identical to what is afforded to NOAA employees? I think
They would have access to the same thing that the NOAA employees have. In addition to that, a lot of the Office of Law Enforcement provides a tremendous amount of outreach and education and compliance assistance. That said, because of these vessels, sometimes they're in waters that are under Coast Guard jurisdiction or even beyond, really the only leverage we have is whether or not we allow an observer on the boat. Now, if the observer's not on the boat, it's, the boat can't go fish because of the quotas. So we do have some leverage with respect to actual observers on boats, but beyond that, what happens on the boat is up to the Coast Guard or in international waters.
Well, thanks very much. And so let's say, for example, you have an observer on a boat in the Gulf of Mexico who's he's assaulted, and he wishes to report this immediately, and he's going to disembark the vessel. And so walk me through what they can do, what communication device you're certain that they have on their person, and what NOAA's immediate and follow-up responses would be.
So they would be equipped with a beacon. It's a transponder device that relays a signal to a satellite. It notifies the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard wouldn't know the type of alert. I mean, you could alert or signal this beacon whether the ship was sinking or the observer feels threatened. The Coast Guard will respond as fast as possible. In that case, then we're alerted, and depending on where they are, we get services and victim advocates in contact with them to figure out what the next steps would be.
Great, thank you. I'm going to recognize the gentleman from California once again, 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the extra time to continue this conversation. And Ms. Dale, I wonder if you could talk a little more about STAR's relationship with NOAA and how that works?
Sorry, thank you for the question. Absolutely. So STAR has been responding to observers being harmed on boats for many, many, many years as one of the leading victim advocacy services through Alaska. We have been providing training to certain portions of NOAA observers, their supporters. So that looks like prevention and response training, making sure that they know how to respond appropriately if an observer is harmed, but also providing a multidisciplinary, centralized response throughout Alaska if an observer is harmed. We have our marine highway system that is literally non-existent right now. Ferries are not running. People are not able to get in or out of many, many hub communities, and Anchorage being the easiest to access and the largest, we're able to provide those services to observers that are harmed as soon as possible. And so with us having that relationship with NOAA, we're able to provide the best response services.
Thank you. And since you began that partnership with NOAA, it's what, 2 years, did you say?
Well, we've just gone into contract, just very recently. That just started this year.
Okay.
But we've been providing non-contracted services, but we haven't tracked that since there was no contract in place. So,
All right.
yeah.
Well, let's say, going back to when you first started working with NOAA, how many calls have you actually received from NOAA employees or contractors?
Since we've been keeping track of that information, one.
Only one. That strikes me as a pretty low number. Do you have any idea why that number would be so low?
I have some speculations on that. The one phone call that we received was from the Eastern Seaboard, where I've been providing trainings for the last 2 years to their staff on how to respond appropriately. Those observers who are in that program know that if they report, they're going to be responded to appropriately and not just looking for a law enforcement response. So the information that's being relayed in Alaska currently is coming from a law enforcement individual, and they are very well-intentioned and very well-meaning, but the messenger matters whenever we're talking to observers and how they're going to be responded to.
So no calls at all from Alaska where you're actually performing this direct service work?
Not yet.
Dr. Jacobs, how does NOAA communicate the availability of these type of services and resources to its observers?
So particularly, well, agency-wide, I send out all-hands emails. We have training. When it comes to communicating to the observers, the contractors that the observers work for are made aware of these. We also rely heavily on the Office of Law Enforcement, who have relationships with the fishermen, the contractors for the observers and such. So this is why I said earlier it's a two-pronged approach. We have to set up the victim advocacy and how we process the data and deal with this issue, but we also have to set up a system of outreach so that the victims actually know where to go and what process to follow.
All right, and you're describing a lot of resources that are set up for your personnel, but are these resources available directly for victims in the same way that STAR is?
So STAR is our victim
So STAR is
advocacy
the
in
answer,
Alaska.
basically. Okay, do you have plans or contracts in other regions that are like the services that you've contracted with for STAR?
So we have six different contracts. They differ depending on what they do. Some are more for outreach, some are more for victim advocacy. when we're dealing with issues in the CONUS, it's largely we have one victim advocate and then others that are trained that are awaiting certification. So this is an ongoing process that we're trying to staff out.
All right. Well, I appreciate the conversation with all of you. Clearly, NOAA's starting to make some positive changes. I hope this conversation and some of the information we've brought forward and you've shared with us underscores the fact that there's certainly a lot of room for improvement. And we look forward to working with you in that regard. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Huffman. And Ms. Dale, it's clear here that fishery observers are in this very unique and vulnerable position by being out on fishing boats and vessels for alone days, weeks, and months. And in your testimony, you mentioned some example that the tactics fishermen may use to intimidate and manipulate, fishery observers early on in the fishing trip, like telling them to shuck scallops or clean the slime line. And as you note, these behaviors sometimes escalate into sexual assault or harassment. Could you provide just a little bit more elaboration or color on these behaviors and how they can lead to harassment and assault?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. We know that ultimately sexual harassment and sexual violence is done out of power and control. Those are the components that are always present whenever we have individuals that are experiencing harm. The things that we talked about, the shucking scallops or the cleaning the slime line, is often identified as hazing. It's an initiation that almost always happens to individuals whenever they step foot onto a boat. And like I mentioned, all of those components are meant to maintain power and control. That way, the observer, they're immediately with a lesser hand than any of the individuals, the fisher people on the boats. So they're utilizing all of these various tactics to maintain leverage over those individuals so they're not able to report the potentially illegal fishing activities that are happening. Also, like you mentioned, that's how the individuals on the boats are making their money. And if they feel like they're not going to be bringing in the funding for themselves that they potentially would be with the catch, the individuals are experiencing severe amounts of sexual harassment and sexual violence.
Thanks very much. And Ms. Seabrook, Ms. Dale, and Dr. Jacobs, the basic question is whether or not the fishing community recognizes that a culture of intimidation and harassment isn't okay. And is there a culture shift that's happening at all that you see, or is there still this culture of acceptance for that?
I don't really know about the fishing industry per se, but I know that it has happened and there has been transformations in other industries. For example, the agricultural industry, when I was speaking about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the program that they put in place that was very worker-centered and survivor-centered reduced the incidence of sexual harassment and violence in the field and farms in Immokalee, Florida, from rampant down to zero. There has not been a single allegation of serious sexual harassment after implementation of the program.
Ms. Dale?
I have not seen a reduction in the culture of harm in the fishing industry. I know that it can happen. I know that work can be done, and it needs to be impacted not just by NOAA, but we need to start impacting that culture change within the fishing industry, as well as the providers, the contractors, and the captains of these boats. This is pervasive in the fishing industry, and we haven't seen a change in culture yet, a change in the norms. It can happen. I do believe that the work can be done. I don't believe that all of the fishing industry people want to harm individuals and continue this pervasive culture. So, with the work being done and the information that is being put out and the partnerships that are happening, we absolutely can see a change in cultural norms on the fishing boats, but it's not happening yet.
Okay. Dr. Jacobs?
I would completely agree with that. It's a culture shift. It's going to be a long challenge, and I really, I hope that what we can do as an agency is to move in the direction of changing. I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to come here today. I know that the subject matter experts are sitting behind me, but this was such a top priority for NOAA. So thank you for having me here. I did want to mention that even though we're really trying to face this culture change head on and drive it in the direction that we want to, we also are focused on electronic monitoring and artificial intelligence, because I would envision one day that we may not need observers if we could do this through electronic monitoring.
Well, great, thank you for that. And we do recognize the positive steps that NOAA's been taking with regard to this. And if I could follow up, is that, as we discussed, NOAA is required to provide an annual report to Congress on sexual harassment and sexual assault incidents that are reported each year. And a couple of questions there. Are the regions submitting this data in any type of standardized way? Two, are you able to track ongoing investigations through the data that's submitted? And for example, would you be able to see whether or not an investigation is taking unnecessarily long time? And finally, are you able to track data on disciplinary corrective actions that are being taken when allegations are substantiated?
So this is the reason why we stood up the SASH Council. So I get regular tag-ups with them. I get quarterly reports. So there's two things that we've put in place to address this problem. The short answer is, historically, that data exists, but it's not centralized. It's not in a common format. If we need the information, we have to go dig it up. In some cases, depending on where it's collected, they may not necessarily know exactly where to report it. Over the last 12 months, we've done a much better job of aggregating these data sets, but this is the one reason why we need to stand up a database. We need to have a centralized database. The centralized database will force everyone to come up with a common format, thereby allowing us to sort through the numbers and get a better analysis and keep track of the data in better real time. But the short answer is, the data does exist, it's not centrally located, and we need a common format, hence the database.
Great, thanks for that. And Ms. Seabrook, it would be great if you could weigh in on that. Really to the fact, is it important to have standardized data tracking across an organization? And how does that help the organization better address a sexual harassment problem?
Yeah, absolutely. Transparency is key. If survivors don't see that the system is working, then they will not have confidence in the system, and they won't engage the policies of the organization. I would also make a recommendation that the annual report, if possible, if there could be an annual climate survey, because I think what's really important, it's not just tracking like when reports are made, but you really want to track like who hasn't made a report and why. That's really critical and valuable information for the agency to gather. And then also what's critical about a climate survey is that it's anonymous. If employees feel that or contractors feel that there's any way that information can be tracked back to them, we've seen that kind of reduces the confidence that they have in that climate survey.
No, thank you. And the one thing, and maybe I want to touch on this as well, one thing I know and I've learned is an important component of any anti-harassment program is a way to hold managers and supervisors, if they're accountable, when they don't take the steps they need to report or follow up on an incidence of harassment. And can you provide a little bit more, once again, elaborate on that and why is it important? What are some of the ways that the agency can do to help with that regard?
Sure. So we've helped other federal agencies with implementing their policies and practices. One recommendation that we have made to agencies and to other organizations outside of the federal government is to have adherence to the policy as part of the annual performance evaluation. If the manager has a track record of ignoring reports, right, not following through with investigations, minimizing reports, then that's actually reflected on the performance evaluation and taken into account in terms of ratings going forward.
And that's a great point. Thank you very much. I want to thank you all again for answering the questions and for being here today. I think it's been very informative, and I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to describe whatever else you think needs to be done and how we can ensure that happens. And we can certainly start with you, Ms. Seabrook, and Ms. Dale, then Dr. Jacobs.
So you mentioned before, or actually no, I think maybe it was Ms. Dale who mentioned before about like the law enforcement response. There's something within the policy that I noticed that may inhibit a survivor from coming forward. So if you look at section 6.01, it talks about employees who observe or the object of sexual harassment, should report. Swift reporting allows appropriate law enforcement authorities and the agency to take measures to ensure that offensive behavior stops. There's always a concern to me because we know that the criminal justice system is not as trauma-informed and responsive to the needs of survivors. It can be can be an inhibiting factor, especially if you put that first within the policy. So my recommendation would just to be to take out law enforcement entirely and just leave it as the agency, because the agency may conclude that law enforcement is necessary to be reported to, but at least that gives the survivor some confidence in the fact that there's going to be a process and it's not just going to go directly to a law enforcement report. So that's one thing I definitely saw.
All right, thank you. Ms. Dale?
Something that best practices whenever responding to an individual that's been harmed is a multidisciplinary approach, and to make sure that individuals and observers that are reporting are only having to relay their information or their story one time to as few people as possible to help make sure that they're not re-traumatized continually, I think is very, very important and key, and can really be a part of this response to observers, making sure that those best practices are in place, and supporting NOAA as an agency and the work that's being done to make sure that our observers are safe. Yeah.
Great point. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And we'll conclude with Dr. Gallo, or Jacobs, I beg your pardon.
I think I actually had the chance to cover most of the things, but I would like to highlight one thing that I haven't talked about, and that's OMAO. And I really got to give a tremendous amount of credit to Admiral Styla and Admiral Hahn for really cracking down on what was going on in OMAO. And that really sent a message through particularly through the vessels and the fleet that there's a zero tolerance with this. I'd also look forward to working with you on how we can look at the language in the MSA, because this complicates the job of the law enforcement agency. They have a really good working relationship with a lot of the local observer community, but if they're in a situation with observers that, depending on where an incident happened, the observer may have to report it either to us or to local law enforcement officials, it really complicates the situation. And it also erodes the trust in the observers with whether or not they actually think that the NOAA law enforcement is going to have complete control and have their back and be able to defend them, whether the incident actually happened on a vessel or in port. Basically my job is to clear the deck to make sure that everyone in NOAA feels safe and has the ability to do their job. So this is why this is such a high priority for me, and I really, really appreciate your support.
Great, thank you once again to all the witnesses. And before we close out, I ask for unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record. A statement from the Association of Professional Observers, an anonymous statement from a NOAA scientist, a statement from Fishery Observer Simeon Kagilaba, and a statement from Fishery Observer Patrick Carroll. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Once again, I want to thank all the witnesses again for being here today. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.